Hello. Today I will briefly talk to you about an important thinker whose writings have been extremely important in our understanding of the relationship between media production and consumption. So Stuart Hall was a cultural theorist and a political activist, and he was a key figure in the discipline of cultural studies, which is basically the study of how cultural practices relate to wider systems of power relations and the way in which these relations operate through social phenomena like ideology, like ethnicity, like sexual orientation, like gender, and so on and so forth. As we will see in this video and from the text that you are reading, Hall is heavily influenced by the authors you read previously, most notably Ferdinand de Saussure and Roland Barthes. But Hall's main concern is the politics of signification, right? Remember Saussure's idea of how the signifier and the signified work together and produce signification. What Hall is interested in is how the signifier and the signified are connected together in the media, and specifically the political forces, right? Politics basically means power here, right? The political forces or the power relations that produce these connections. So Hall uses his understanding of Saussure and Barthes to develop a model of communication that is very different from those that thought about communication before him. And we're thinking specifically here of those who understood the communication process in terms of something that we can call reliability, right? In the sense of the reliability of the transmitting channels. For example, the linear models of communication that basically thought of communication as a one-way street, where you have a sender transmitting a message through a channel to a recipient, and this process can be influenced by noise, right? Now, in these models, if messages are not received as intended by the sender, this is considered as a failure of communication. So according to models like these, messages are not received correctly if the channels of communication from sender to recipient are distorted by electrical or human error, for example. So it's someone or something's fault that communication didn't succeed. This idea of communication presumes that the meanings of messages are universally transferable, that the meaning itself is stable and attached to the message in a solid way. All we need for communication to happen, according to this model, is to make sure that the channels of communication are working properly. If there is distortion of the message, it is either because the channels don't work or maybe because the sender and the receiver, or one of them or both, have a problem. According to Hall, these models, this way of thinking about communication, is really problematic because they ignore the context in which communication takes place. Communication never happens in a void, right? It is always situated in a context. Well, the better word here would be structure, not really context. And that context or structure is specifically social, economic, or political. The people who produce and receive messages occupy specific positions in this structure. And therefore, the meanings of messages can indeed be distorted, not by the channel necessarily, but according to the positions of the senders and the audiences. To put it in Hall's own words, meaning is a social production, right? Meaning is a discursive process. It operates within a language system, right? A set of codes. Therefore, Hall proposes a new model of communication that is not linear and uses semiotics to explain the sense-making process, the process in which meanings are created, and the social, political, and economic frames of reference that underlie it, the relations of power, as well as the infrastructure that shape the processes of communication. Now, language is encoded, right? It's made to mean something. This is what we saw in the previous lecture. It is encoded by those who have the means, right? The material means the political means, the social position that allows them to create quotes. And these people have the power to encode meaning. These are the ones who own the media production companies, or the TV networks, or the advertising companies, and so on. These encoded messages are then decoded by the audience, who make sense of them. They decode them according to their place in the discursive structure. And this model of communication is generally referred to as the encoding-decoding model of communication. Now, in contrast to the previous models of communication, Hall's model of encoding-decoding does not assume a direct correspondence between the meaning intended by the sender and how the meaning is interpreted by the audience. Why? Because the codes of encoding and decoding may not be perfectly symmetrical or identical. Instead, Hall is interested in how media represent and misrepresent what they mean, rather than simply the ways in which they reflect those meanings to their audiences. In other words, why is it that certain meanings are encoded in particular ways by media producers, and they are in turn decoded in different particular ways by the audience? It is not so much the content of the messages that concern Hall as the rules that govern their encoding, right? The structure and the things that shape the choice to represent or misrepresent, or to perceive or to misperceive. The processes of encoding by media production, Hall tells us, is not arbitrary. They operate according to a set of professional codes, like technical competence and high-budget production values. These professional codes then construct preferred meanings that have the institutional, political, or ideological, that's a really important word, order imprinted in them, and have themselves become institutionalized. And these are Hall's own words from the text. For example, the BBC in Britain, or France Télévisions here in France. Both operate according to the public service rules, or the public service context. One characteristic of these rules is that programs produced by the BBC or by France Télévisions need to be impartial. They cannot, or they're not supposed to, take sides, for example, in debates, in presidential debates. They cannot openly advocate a certain presidential candidate over another. In these examples, the preferred meaning intended by the BBC or by France 2 is political impartiality. Now, this generates the assumption that audiences would not decode partial or biased political points of view if they adopt France Télévisions' preferred meaning. Now, although preferred meanings are a powerful element in the processes of media communication as they shape the encoding, basically, preferred meanings don't actually determine the way the messages are interpreted by the audience. This is Hall's point. The audience does not simply absorb the preferred meanings constructed by the media producers, because their frame of reference does not necessarily correspond with the frame of reference that structured the encoding processes. In a word, the media are like language systems, right? Their messages are constructed through a set of rules or codes and values, just like linguistic messages, which have denotative and connotative meanings, as we saw with Roland Barthes. These qualities make media messages highly susceptible to ideological constructions of meanings. In conclusion, Hall's theory of communications offers us a very useful model for understanding how media messages are constructed and interpreted, with a specific focus on the idea that the audience is not a completely passive receptacle for the messages. That media production and representation is almost never neutral. There is a power relation, compliance, and resistance in communication, and so on. Right, so I hope this video was useful in making Hall's text a bit more accessible. Now you need to go back to the text, right, as usual, and prepare detailed answers for the questions that we'll discuss together in class. All the best, and see you in class.